very brief, heartfelt welcome to the beginning of the Martin Luther King events here at the University of Utah. And as the College of Education, we are extremely proud and privileged to be a part of the week-long event. As a matter of fact, we're one of the kickoff events for this week. This is our second year in partnership with the Office of Diversity and the Office of Academic Affairs. And I welcome my colleagues, such as VP Honda, the Office of Academic Affairs, who have worked so hard on these week-long events. And I do hope that in addition to all of you who are here today and able to come to this beginning lecture and panel, that you'll be able to participate throughout the week. And I think are some very historic and exciting times, both for the university, the state, and the country. I also want to acknowledge some other special guests. Of course, there's always a danger when you do this for someone else. You can't not acknowledge two former deans sitting side by side here in the College of Education, Dave Sperry and Ted Packard. And we welcome you. I also want to acknowledge Chuck Foster from the Division of Indian Affairs, the State Office of Education. Welcome. And Noah Lodge, who is our American Indian Teacher Education Consortium Director. And if I've left anybody else out, I sincerely apologize. Before I turn the time over to Professor Calderon, there she is. Once again, I just want to say welcome. This is our first year for the College of Education Distinguished, and I have to be careful because Johnny doesn't like this term, but senior means in a very positive and prestigious way. Distinguished senior scholar in diversity, access, and equity. And we're very, very pleased to initiate this award and to recognize tonight our distinguished senior scholar, Donna Diley, who will be making a presentation, and to welcome our panel, who will be joining Donna and will be introduced very shortly. So, without further ado, and with the time that we have, I want to make sure that we leave adequate time for both the lecture, the panel, and for the reception as well. And I see standing right in front of me that I've visited Assistant Dean Queen as Queen Winchie. Welcome. Coming back to school. Glad you're here as well. Anyway, from the College of Education to all of you, thank you for being here. And now it's my privilege to introduce our moderator for this evening, Professor Dolores Calderon.
Thank you.
I'm
going to stand back here because I have some bios that I'd like to share a little bit of information with everybody. First, thank you for coming. I'm really excited about today's event. I just came back from home and I was a little homesick, so it's really good to see all these faces here and to have this event. It's kind of a nice welcome home for myself here at Utah. So as Dean Hartman said, we're celebrating the work of Dr. Diley as the distinguished, I'll just say distinguished scholar for the College of Education. And we have with us three panelists that will also be commenting on what she talks about from their perspectives on issues of equity and access and Indian education particularly, and their experiences. So before I talk about Dr. Diley, I want to turn attention to our three distinguished panelists to give you a little bit of information and help us welcome them. First, we have Dr. Calvin White. He's a PhD from White Cone, Arizona. He earned his doctorate in counseling and psychology in 1998 from here at the University of Utah. And he's currently employed with the Office of Diné Science, Math, and Technology with the Department of Diné Education under the executive branch of the Navajo Nation government. He was also the principal investigator of the Navajo Nation Rural Systemic Initiative. And so I'm very excited to have him here. I'm happy he was able to come all the way from Arizona to join us today. So if we could give him a round of applause. As you're going to see, all our panelists have this wonderful breadth of experience from different backgrounds, so it's going to make this event even more exciting. We also have Janice Jones-Schroeder, who's a supervisor for the Multicultural Education, MESA, World Languages programs for the Salt Lake City School District, and she also sits on the board for the National Association of Multicultural Education. Born in North Carolina, she moved to Buffalo, New York as a teenager, where she started college as a single mother of 4 and finished her undergraduate studies at the University of New York, Buffalo. Then she moved on to get her master's and worked for the New York State Department of Education. She then left education and worked in equal employment opportunity and human rights work, returning again to education to head the Indian bilingual program for Buffalo schools. She then also went to Oklahoma to head the Indian Bilingual Center, which oversaw the states of Oklahoma, Utah, and Wyoming. In her capacity as president of the National Bilingual Association, she was recruited to come to Utah, so we are very excited to have Janice Schroeder here with us today as well. And last but not least, Dr. Lillian Tom Orm, a member of the Diné Navajo Nation, born and raised on the Navajo Indian Reservation in New Mexico, is joining us as well. Diné was her first language, and she remains fluent in her native tongue. She is a research assistant professor in the Department of Internal Medicine here at the University of Utah School of Medicine, and has an adjunct appointment in the departments of oncological science and pediatrics in the College of Nursing. She holds graduate degrees in transcultural nursing and public health from the University of Utah. She is a consultant and author in transcultural nursing and health. She is currently evaluating the Navajo Special Diabetes Program and has served as consultant for urban-based diabetes programs at the Indian Walk-In Center here in Salt Lake City. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lillian. And so now we're moving on to speak a little bit about Dr. Diley. She didn't want me to say too much, but I think, since we are honoring her breadth of work and the commitment that she's demonstrated to Indian education, I'd like to take this opportunity to say a little bit about Dr. Diley. Dr. Diley is one person that I've looked up to in my career, and her work as something that kind of work that I would eventually like to do. So hopefully here at the University of Utah I can follow in those footsteps. Thank you, Dr. Diley. She's a professor here, for those of us who don't know, in the Department of Education, Culture, and Society, and she's the coordinator of the American Indian Studies program and Ethnic Studies program here. Her major professional interests focus on anthropology and education, cultural conflict, racism, critical race theory, and education of American Indians. Her research and fieldwork is focused on educational issues in cross-cultural settings as diverse as Brazil, Peru, Australia, and various American Indian reservations in the United States. Her book, In Place, Navajo Mothers and Daughters, is forthcoming with the University of Arizona Press in the fall of 2009. I know I'm looking forward to reading that. Amongst other things, she's been recognized for the excellence of her research. In 2002, Dr. Diley received the George and Louis Spindler Award for a distinguished career in educational anthropology from the Council of Education and Anthropology and the American Anthropological Association. She has also received the Distinguished Achievement Award from the Educational Press Association of America for her article, Cultural Differences in Child Development, Navajo Adolescents in Middle Schools. She has also been the recipient of 3 faculty research awards and the College of Education Service Award from the University of Utah, 2 Spencer Foundation's research grants, as well as the Spencer Fellowship from the National Academy of Education. No doubt, Dr. Diley is the 2009 Diversity Distinguished Senior Scholar recipient. So I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Diley.
I was told I had to put this on. Is it? The red light's there. Okay. Wow. This is an extraordinary, honor. And I have carefully orchestrated about a half-an-hour presentation, and I'd like to read you through it so I won't start wandering around. In my upcoming book, In Place, Navajo Mothers and Daughters, focus on the life stories of 3 Navajo women and their families that I've known for 25 years. Vanjie Sosi's chapter, Changing Woman at Taco Bell, Middle-Class Life in the City, describes a post-Indian warrior claiming a native presence on the landscape. Like Changing Woman, a beloved figure in Navajo cosmology, she had her kinalda, a coming-of-age and puberty ceremony, in honor of her place as a Navajo woman. She strategically moved through high school, changing from the racially charged San Juan High School to move to Whitehorse High School, located and surrounded by the Navajo Nation, as a path to graduate in order to, quote, get on with my life. She faced racism with resilience. They think we're dumb, but it's the whites who don't have the knowledge that Navajos have. She asserted Navajo claims of the original occupancy on the landscape. If they, whites, don't like Navajos, why'd they move here? And her first job in Salt Lake City was at Taco Bell. She quit this job and many others when she felt disrespected by her employers. I needed to go home to a ceremony, and my boss said I needed to choose between my family and my job. This was a no-brainer. He didn't care about me. As I would come to understand, she claimed the purpose of a job was for money, not self-esteem or for her career. And given the kinds of limited career opportunities most Navajo men and women are trained for, caring primarily about the money you got from your labor investment was a very wise and sound decision. She was a hard worker, conscientious and thoughtful with post-secondary training, and she had no problem finding employers who were willing to give her jobs. But none of her skills and education, however, led her to middle-class careers. This was because, in part, her education did not serve her well, but in fact robbed her of the kinds of networks needed to move beyond the vocational level opportunities schools had prepared her for. In 2005, Vanjie and her family gave up the burden of a house mortgage here in Salt Lake City and the empty urban landscape and returned to their families on the Navajo Nation. It's not fulfilling, she said softly. At first, it used to be our thinking that we were working for the house. And then we got the house, and then I was tired of being here. I wanted to be with my family, and my daughters needed to be around Navajo people. The only thing I miss are the fast food restaurants I see on TV. You can't have Pizza Hut delivered all the way out here. Teasingly, I questioned, changing woman Mrs. Taco Bell? She grinned. Yeah, I do miss that. In our last interview, Vanjie leaned back and shook her head. It's a lot different than what most whites think. She paused, then grinned broadly. One of my coworkers said, do you Indians dress like that, in leather buckskins with a feather in your hair? I said, no. Indians are dressing like cowboys. It's the whites who are dressing up like Indians. We both grinned at the image. Now, this is true. This is absolutely true. At that point, I reached over and pulled out a Saturday, June 2nd, 2005, Salt Lake Tribune newspaper clipping on the centennial celebration in San Juan County. The color picture's caption read, a local theater group rehearses a play that incorporates not only the past 100 years, but the hundreds before that, when generations of American Indians lived in the Blanding area. On stage were 5 young Ute and Navajo actors, dressed in the clothing of their ancestors, including moccasins. Behind a 1980 sign, at the center of the stage, stood a white man. He was dressed in a long cotton shirt with a Ute-styled apron and sash over Levi slacks and leather shoes, and he appeared to be deep in thought. with his eyes closed and his arms outstretched. Sticking out from his bandana were long black braids like those worn by Italian actors in old westerns. Even today, whites don't look good playing Indian. We both laughed until we cried. My recent work attempts to present the toughness, the ingenuity, the warmth, the wit that characterize the Navajo women I've come to know over the last 25 years as they seek to carve out paths among discourses which exalt the pioneer and the civilizing mission of European American people. And let me just say that the work I'm talking about comes from the Four Corners area, the Utah Strip of the Navajo Nation. You have to be very careful that not all, just like I'm going to be arguing, there's not one way of being Navajo. There's very different histories and different locations on the reservation. So please bracket your thoughts to that part of the Navajo Nation. In my upcoming book, I attempt to portray the discourses of what Gerald Visner calls manifest manners, which are practices emanating from the colonizing ideology of manifest destiny, which presumes white people's rightful ownership of land, educational opportunities, and available jobs. This discourse powerfully shapes the white expectations and Navajo people's lives in ways that are seldom talked about in the mainstream today. One sees this sense of white entitlement in the state of Utah's stealing of mineral lease monies from oil found on the Navajo Nation. As claimed in a 1991 lawsuit, $55 million has left the reservation and gone to white government and corporate groups, while almost half of the Navajo people in this section of the Navajo Nation have no electricity or running water. One sees this sense of white entitlement when cowboys and settlers forcibly removed Navajo families from their homes and lands in the 1950s in Bluff. The Removal Act was 1830, and we're talking 1950, still forcible removal from your land. One sees this sense of entitlement when European Americans feel it's acceptable to appropriate aspects of Navajo religious beliefs in ways that do violence to what Navajo people believe. And you see this when public school officials assert that it's not the district's responsibility to educate Navajo citizens of the county. Until 1960, the mid-60s, Navajo families in the San Juan County area had to send their sons and daughters to distant boarding schools in order to have them have access to high schools. Local white children had access to high school in 1900, 60 years before access for the Navajo families. One of these discourses play out in various ways of surveillance of what Navajo people can and cannot do. And I want to talk about the term blanket Indian, because it's a very good concrete example of surveillance. In the 1880s, Colonel Pratt, who started the very first boarding school, testified in front of Congress and said, "You send me those Indian students, and I will make sure they will not remain blanket Indians. They will pull you away from your reservation, your home, your family, your language." In 1933, Luther Standing Bear, speaking about being a blanket Indian as a means of survival, said, or survivance, "According to the white man, the Indian, choosing to return to his tribal manners and dress, goes back to the blanket." True, but going back to the blanket is the factor that has saved him, or at least stayed his final destruction. Had the Indian been as completely subdued in spirit as he was in body, he would have perished within a century of his subjugation. But it is the unquenchable spirit that has saved him, his clinging to Indian ways, Indian thought and tradition, that has kept him and is keeping him today. I heard the term blanket Indian over the 2.5 decades I did my research in San Juan County being constantly used to describe Navajo and youth who refused to conform to white expectations of Indians. So what I came to discover in my own research were teachers who set up norms of behavior based on their conceptions of good, I put in parentheses white, students, and applied those norms to judge the academic and social activities of Navajo youth. As a youth I hung out with sought to navigate through surveillance, they adopted strategies of resistance against school officials who demanded Indian youth judge themselves against their white peers. To do differently, to look differently, or have different life goals were signs of failure, of being a blanket Indian. Choosing to stay at home, living on the Navajo Nation, was described as being suffocated by unprogressive families. Choosing basic level education courses to be among Navajo peers to avoid racial conflict was described as a lack of academic motivation. Choosing to attend Navajo ceremonies as well as various Christian denominational services was described as clinging to the past. And choosing to be with one's family over careers was described as a tragic flaw in laziness. The ideology of manifest manners allows whites to construct representations of Indian people that are frozen, and this is a very important point for me, that's frozen in a historical past. And this ignores the extraordinarily rich cultural practices of Indian people surrounding them, and it serves to maintain white powers in the larger social structure. An example of what I believe is a discourse of this manifest manners, again, I read the Salt Lake Trib, appears on Wednesday, March 9th, 2005, in an article entitled Bennett, "The Oil Rigs Won't Hurt Wildlife." After visiting the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to examine the impact oil drilling would have on this refuge, Utah Senator Bob Bennett met with Alaskan natives, saying most were in favor of oil development. In a critique of Alaskan natives opposed to oil drilling, he said, "But when you ask them how they live off the caribou, you find out they get on snowmobiles and go out and shoot them with rifles. Somehow, I don't think that's the culture of their great-grandparents that they're talking about preserving." So to have an authentic Native Alaskan voice, leave the snowmobile and rifles at home, and pull out great-grandfather's harpoons and spears. So this authentic Indian is best served by limited contact with the corrupting Western values in economic, educational, and social institutions, increasing, ironically, the likelihood of economic struggles during their lives. Quote, "The more traditional Navajos wake up to the sunrise with prayers every morning," a counselor told me my first year of research. He had sighed, leaned back in his chair, and said, "Maybe our Anglo way is wrong. We should not be pushing them towards it. We have too much strain in our Anglo world. Look how calm the Indians are. They have such a simple and pure life. I sometimes think that Navajos in this traditional environment might have been better off." Counselors and teachers repeatedly told me over the last 2.5 decades, Navajos work well with their hands as a cultural justification for vocational ed, and with the underlying belief that Navajo can't meet white academic expectations. Those students from Monument Valley, they're the real Navajos, a teacher told me. Most of them still do chores around the house like herding sheep. They're dignified and quiet, and they do what they're told in the classroom. Visner argues that news stories need to be told as acts of resistance to this white surveillance. Indians should not represent themselves in ways that bring satisfactions to whites, to white representations. And this is a quote from Visner. "If a culture lives, it changes. It always changes. If people live, they imagine themselves always in a new sense. And here we are in the city, and the people are still trying to figure out what was in the past. Well, there isn't any past. We're it." White narratives of manifest manner, however, still try to capture and frame real Indians as relics of the past. And here's one of my favorite stories. It's a story that circulated here at the University of Utah, and for those of you who've been here long enough, this is a story, incident that happened to Pat Albers from the anthropology department. So a professor had sent several white students to visit another professor who taught courses on American Indians. "We're looking for examples of pure Indians," said one. Another interjected, "We want to visit real Indians. We're told that the Utes are an example of a hunting and gathering Indian tribe." My colleague sighed and explained, "Yes, the Utes are hunters and gatherers. The Utes hunt at Safeway and gather at 7-Eleven. Frozen in time, real Indians cannot possibly be shopping alongside everyone else at the local store. The very act of manifest manners assures that the presence of contemporary lives is muted in support of a simulation of real Indians. In the communities I discussed, this is evident, for example, in the development of cultural units that use living Navajo to talk about or reconstruct traditions of the past. This captures the past to bring it to the future, is both predicated on the concept of American Indianness as a vanishing way of life and a vision of the right kind of Indian, and both of these are dialogues of a manifest manners. So rather than seeing Navajo parents, teachers, students, sons and daughters themselves as members of a vibrant community today, they're used as resources to teach about past traditions. And this is manifest manners at work. Thus, in effect, both culture and race are used against Navajo youth. These representations of indigenous people, whether they be in spaghetti westerns or dances with wolves or in the talks and teachers' lounges, are images that the Navajo women I write about navigate around as the endeavor to lead good lives, to forge relationships, and to look out after their families. As I write about their lives, I found the concept of survivance, and this was influenced by Gerald Visner and inscribed by Native voices at the National Museum of the American Indians in Washington, D.C., helpful to deepen my understandings. And this is a quote: "Survivance is more than survival. Survivance means redefining ourselves. It means raising our social and political consciousness. It means holding on to ancient principles while eagerly embracing change. It means doing what is necessary to keep our cultures alive." So survivance in this way is a positive resistance standpoint embedded with actions meant to insert and to a certain claim one's native identity and place in the world by rejecting the images of Indians created by whites. So following Visner's lead, I've become attentive to the moments of survivance where my women friends enact their conceptions of being true to themselves and to Navajo people, despite the expectations placed upon them by counselors, teachers, and white community members. As I watched white counselors and teachers enact the surveillance of Navajo students, which sought to keep them bound within the traditional conception of Indians, I learned that Navajo people sometimes invade white expectations via a variety of stealth strategies. But they also directly confront white surveillance with their own native gaze. I've seen white teachers endure the profound silence of a group of Navajo youth who felt disrespected by their teachers in their classrooms. The practice of playing against teachers with the use of silence or shutdowns, blocking teachers' interactions and effectiveness as instructors in classrooms, and dismissing criticisms of themselves by employers in low-paying jobs, all work to assert a native gaze on a racially contested landscape. Now, a vivid example of this native action occurred one day in a high school biology class. Facing a poorly qualified teacher who repeatedly mocked Navajo students with, quote, "Navajos don't know how to learn difficult things," end quote, students walked out, returned with padlocks from their lockers, bolted the door hinges, securely imprisoning their teacher, and left school. She resigned within a week. By directing our attention to these acts of survivance, Visner pushes us beyond the guiding theories that have shaped educational anthropology of indigenous peoples in the past. He warns us against efforts to explain Navajo success and failure by reference to a static, homogeneous conceptions of Navajo culture. For there is no one Navajo culture, and as we've seen, as I've tried to talk about today, the concept of Navajo culture is commonly used against Navajo students as a means of denying them educational opportunities. Although my work does indeed provide rich examples of cultural differences between Navajos and European Americans, my fear is that by focusing on these differences, which are often superficially understood and frozen in history, that we too easily can ignore the deeper layers of denied opportunity due to racism and exclusion. Visner's post-structural focus upon Navajo survivance also pushes us beyond efforts to reach beyond broad generalizations concerning the means by which Navajo people are denied opportunities through patterns of job discrimination and vocational tracking in high school. So these structural models, I'm arguing, where I used to be very much in a cultural difference model, I moved into a structural models, and I'm finding that these structural models overstate the power of economic or racialized institutions on people's lives, and it has the unfortunate result of reducing people to victimhood, and this undercuts their power and their humanity. So even though all 1,500 of the youth I followed through high school and into the workplace did indeed face racialized patterns of school preparation and job placement, each individual's response to these obstacles led to different patterns of survivance. So at this point in my research, I've decided that while we must continue to understand the patterns of racial control which profoundly influence Navajo youth school experiences, we miss a great deal of the picture if we only focus on the racial patterns of schooling in the job market, and we miss the creative, strong responses Navajo individuals and families have to what is an undeniably an unjust system. We also miss the ways in which they reinvent Navajo beliefs, nimbly navigating the obstacles created by a discourse of manifest manners and outfox their European American neighbors. In conclusion, the Navajo gaze of the native gaze of the Navajo people I've come to know insist on the right to remain Indian, and this determination rests firmly on the foundations of tribal sovereignty on and off the Navajo Nation. Vanjie So, as changing woman at Taco Bell, challenges us to understand and to accept what this means. In 1999, at 28, she told me, I never really did give up my traditional ways, even though I was baptized in the LDS church. I went to high school, and I had a bad ear infection. My mom and dad took me out to a medicine man. I had a ceremony done for my ears. They, whites, think it's just hocus pocus, but it's what I believe. I didn't feel like I was breaking the law or anything, because I always think we're praying to the same God anyway. This God knows how to speak Navajo and all different kinds of languages. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have our language and stuff. I'm sure he understands. It's just one person. It's not like there's an LDS God and a Navajo God. Just think how bad they'd be fighting up there. I'm sure he understands what I'm going through. So I never felt obliged to give up being Navajo. And in her concluding remarks in reading my book, the story of her life, and with all these women, they have been authors with me as we've sculpted their lives. So in her concluding remarks in 2008, she said simply, "The one thing we know is that we're Navajo. That will never change." Thank you.
I'm asked to go here first and respond and comment on the work of Professor Donna Diley here. First of all, I'd like to greet each one of you here with a good afternoon and say it's good to see each and every one of you. Some of you I haven't seen for a long time, some of you I'm just getting to know, and some of you I've met for the first time. 제 찬지킨 슬리도 고소니 마시친 오 아시나 시체로 도리 찐다 신날 내 최저 같은 아래 이시나 샤 아래 샤마 홀롱도 시제 홀롱 일까지 제 홀롱 샤르네 이타 콘스타기 란지 이 리처드 예 He's his son. Stand up. This is my son, Richard. He's a graduate, too, from the University of Utah. Well, I just want to comment here. I'm going to comment from 3 points of view. I'm going to comment from a Navajo point of view. And then I'm going to comment from working for the Navajo Nation government. I work for the Department of Education, Navajo Nation, and I administer a program that was funded by the National Science Foundation back in 1998. When I left the university here, I returned home and applied my statistics and research skills and test constructions that I learned here in my department to help the Navajo Nation document the closing the achievement gap in math and science. And looking at their Rural Systemic Initiative, the grant that was given to the Navajo Nation to address that issue on the Navajo Nation. So when I left the university here, that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years. I said I was going to work there 5 years and move on, but I'm being my 10th year with the Navajo Nation, and it's been a very good experience. So I'm going to comment from that point of view. And then also I come from a family of ceremonial traditional medicine people that have very high regard and very lot of traditional knowledge that is not known outside the confines of our community or outside the confines of our ceremonial lodge. It's the kind of information that doesn't get out there. When a researcher comes, they don't expose that information, so I'm going to comment from that point of view. First of all, I was privileged to read some of Professor Diley's work and some of the things that she has written regarding Indian education. And as a Navajo, as the Navajo Nation government, right now is making a bold move, a very bold move that has got a lot of people nervous. They tend to call us Big Navajo, as I've learned in the U.S. government. And the Navajo Nation is moving to proclaim and establish this status as a state educational agency within the Navajo Nation. What does a state educational agency mean? Well, what that means is that the Navajo Nation is going to take control of education practice within the Navajo Nation with Bureau of Indian Education schools and public schools. So everybody's excited about that. Excited in the sense that we're going to have to teach them new things from a perspective of a Navajo point of view. Then we have others that are excited and resistant because they want to do the things the same way and what they're used to. So given that, some of the work that Dr. Diley has done fits into what we are looking at. We're coming from the perspective, the Navajo Nation government's coming from the perspective that formal education, Western education, has left out one single, very important, very basic, fundamental concept, and that's character development. To develop the character of an individual, to be an honest, purposeful, respectful individual, to respect their parents, to respect people, and to administer, for lack of better words, good tidings, good relationships to others, and to work cohesively and collaboratively with community and school. I think that's one of the areas that in the Navajo cultural relationship, the network of relationships, that's the fundamental piece that we call that's how we say it. And I think that covers a lot of things that is not accounted for in Western education. And we begin to realize that the Western education model is documented and administers a linear conceptual model, which sometimes does not fit with the Navajo education perspective of a holistic model. In this case, looking at No Child Left Behind regarding the 100% proficiency in reading and writing by the year 2014. But we're making some progress in that, in enlightening U.S. Department of Education that there's other non-traditional academic variables that account for unexplained variance over the past 100 years that education has been on the Navajo Nation. So given that Dr. Diley's work has pointed to some of those things that we were looking at, and I was very grateful to see that. So I just want to commend you for that. From a traditional perspective, I also sit on the Navajo Nation Human Research Review Board. So I know Dr. Lillian Tom Oram here, through all the things that the University of Utah comes to the Navajo Nation to present, to get the Navajo Nation Human Research Review Board's approval to do any kind of research on the Navajo Nation. For any researcher, any university to come on the Navajo Nation to collect data, to interview students, has to come through the Navajo Nation Human Research Review Board to protect the Navajo subjects that are being included in your study, similar to the University of Utah IRB, which I had a privilege of meeting with some of the members and come into some collaboration on how we can work together. So from that perspective, we see a lot of different research come in, and everybody says the research is good, and everybody wants to move the research along to develop this body of knowledge. But we always stop them sometime when there's, hey, wait a minute. When they begin to use traditional words or traditional concept that they don't fully and completely understand, because when we speak in Navajo, the contextual information is very rich. For example, there was a research protocol that used the word ina. So I asked the researcher, okay, tell me what ina means. What part of ina are you using? What is that? And they had a hard time doing that. And they were going to use this in this community. So I just caution any researcher that to be careful of that. Because, like, for example, Stanak lehe, Yulkay Stanak lehe, Besudison Holon, do Benan Pin Holon, Benahaga Holon, Sudison Holon, do Bojonjik Ehonan Kin, Yat Ehigi, Stanak lehe, Yulkay Stant. So what did I say? This concept of changing woman for us is very sacred. It's a very sacred part of our what we call teaching, beauty ceremonial teaching. It's a very sacred element. Our grandfathers and our grandmothers say, don't use it out of context. Use it in that ceremony where that ceremony is taken. Use that there, right there, in that context. or use it in prayer when you have this kadipin or this white corn when you're out in prayer, or psalm. Use that only then. Don't take it beyond that. That's how I was informed by my grandfathers. My grandfather, he was a medicine man. He lived to be 104 years old, and that was his teaching. That was his teaching, and he lived that lifestyle. So when researchers come in and maybe they don't fully understand that, but they want to use it because maybe it sounds mysterious, or maybe it sounds good or something. That part, you got to be very cautious of it for people such as the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation Human Research Review Board has 2 cultural experts on our board that look out for these things and say, be careful, researcher, maybe you need to focus that different. The reason why is that sometimes, I guess, researchers are maybe in their own way have a innocent thought and are respectful of our people, but once it gets out into the public, it gets misrepresented. We just finished reviewing a research protocol that bypassed the Navajo Nation Research Review Board and stated all these misconceptions of an interview that had taken place around southern Utah as well. And this document was published out in England, France, and was released out there. And a concerned citizen from that community brought that to us and said, this is what's going on. How come you didn't stop this? So this giving caution to that with regard to the reference to this individual here. And then also, I think that we are in need of good research. We're in need of good research. Just as I had mentioned, I was talking to Cecilia today or yesterday. Talking about my experience and her experience working with higher ed institutions, and then down over here working with public schools and working with BIE grant schools. There seems to be a significant disconnect with both. Higher ed is okay, they're doing what they're supposed to do, okay. Over here, K-12, State Department, they're doing what they're supposed to do. But it seems like there's no parallel in some ways of how to teach students, how to bring, for lack of better words, best practices. That's one thing I hear, best practices. Okay, whose best practice is it? Is it Calvin's best practice, or is it the Navajo Nation's best practice, or is it University of Utah's best practice? So we need good research done. And the Navajo Nation is looking out for good research on Navajo. I know with University of Utah, I think Dr. Orem has brought that good image of the University of Utah to the Navajo Nation. So through her, there's some trust in the university. I don't have to tell you, or maybe I have to remind you, that the Navajo Nation and other Indian tribes, in terms of research, have been misrepresented in many different ways, and got to be cautious of that. There's some pending lawsuits against universities in the state of Arizona regarding the misuse of blood samples and data. So I just want to caution Donna on that, and commend her for all her work that she has done here, in having and befriending the Navajo Nation and the southern Navajos over here, southern Utah Navajos. They're northern Navajos to us, but we're all the same. We're all the same. We always, from our traditional viewpoint, when we hear our traditional people, like you'll get a Navajo philosopher come from northern Navajo, southern Utah, or western Navajo. When you bring them together, it's the same. The philosophical teaching is pretty much the same. the basic principles. There's what we call principles and principles. I guess for in English translation, to put it in a linear concept, beauty way principles and protection way principles. But when you talk about it, Navajo becomes holistic. There's a spirit about it that regulates an individual's physical, mental, spiritual, psychological growth. It regulates that, and it becomes very detailed. So there's I guess like for lack of a better word, contemporary Navajo or modern Navajo, or it seems like they don't really understand that. But our traditional people, they tell us always, you have relatives over there. That ceremony that came from northern Navajo, southern Utah, and we'll see those relatives. And then those relatives come over to our area, and I've seen the collaboration of our elders like that. So I think that those things in the future, working with the Navajo Nation, you have to be mindful of that. Other than that, I'm very grateful for your work and all the scholarship and the recognition that you're receiving today. I believe that somebody must have prayed for you from the Navajo side to say, hey, Utah, University of Utah, blessed somebody, and it was you. So it's good. So I appreciate that, and I want to give her and say, aho, that means thank you. Aho, good. Nijonahe, you've done good work. So from the Navajo Nation, I spoke to my tribal division. We have a Board of Education, and then we have a Navajo Nation Council Education Committee, and said, this woman's going to be recognized for doing research with Navajo. What shall I tell her? What do you want me to say to her? I said, well, tell her, aho, thank you for doing that work, and keep up the good work, and be sure to collaborate within the right framework with Navajo, and we'll be good friends. That's how they had mentioned to us. So from the Navajo Nation, I want to say thank you and commend you for that.
I'm going to let you go next.
Oh, okay. I'll go ahead and go next. I wanted to defer to Calvin, my elder. I'm kidding. No, he came directly from the Navajo Reservation, so I wanted him to go first and, bring you all the wonderful stuff he said. And I know that wherever I've been where he speaks, there's a lot that he teaches, and I always learn something. And so I wanted to make sure that you all heard that. And then the other thing is, I did tell him, as a good Navajo woman, I want you to go first, and as a good Navajo man, he did go first. So I too would like to say yate to everybody, and ahead to Donna for the wonderful work that she's been doing, and I'm sure this is not the end. She will continue to do more work. I've known Dr. Dolly for many years, and we were trying to count the years before we started here. When I was in my doctoral program, I was very interested in ethnographic research methods because I was in this transcultural nursing program and wanting to know directly from people who receive health care, how they wish to receive health care, what the different ways of learning about their ways are, so that healthcare providers could provide the best optimal health care. And so I took her class, and she reminded me that my daughter, who I can't remember how old she was at the time, but would come and would sit under the table and all of this. And she's now 27 years old, so wow. And that daughter actually is at Georgia State right now, and she's preparing to go to medical school soon. So it's been a long journey, I guess, but I've always enjoyed reading the work that Donna has published, and I know a lot of it because I'm Navajo as well, and has written about people from what's called the Utah Strip, and sometimes people from that area have called it no man's land because they're in southeastern Utah. they're sort of removed from the larger Navajo reservation, and then they're way down south, away from the capital of Utah, and so their governments, the Navajo Nation capital is further south, and the state, if they need to do work with the state, it's so far away. So they always have said, we feel like we are in no man's land. Some of the things that I've done is I've worked for the state health department for about 15 years, and I had a project down south, and so I used to visit, down there. So that's where, I learned about this and Donna's work down there. And interestingly, a lot of the things that Donna talks about, the issues of diversity, of equity, justice, access to education and ways of learning and various things like this, different worldviews. All of those kinds of things we also discuss in healthcare. And the same types of injustice, that she discusses in educational, I've also experienced in healthcare. When I worked at the state level, there's one of the things that I did was as TB control officer for the state. And so we went through a huge era of infectious diseases, and TB being one of those, and of course smallpox many years back. But a few years ago, there was the TB rates were going up again, and so I had CDC money that I could use for the state of Utah and different pockets of the population that had high rates. And so when I gave funds to the people down in southeast Utah, I mean, everybody just sort of jumped, why are you, their rates are or there's no TB down there. There's just no TB. There's no homeless people. There aren't any homeless people. There aren't those high-risk populations that we find here in downtown Salt Lake. People with HIV, people with immunocompromised states, that sort of thing. So all I had to do is use my epidemiology, come up with figures, and sure enough, the rates were really high. And so, we just had to keep justifying all these things. And so, a lot of those, kind of hoops that you see people going through in the area of education, we do the same types of things in healthcare, constantly asking for funds. And, once you figure these prevalence and incidence rates for various diseases, for instance, diabetes. It was mentioned that I'm going to be working with the Navajo Nation, evaluating the Navajo Nation Diabetes Program. Rates will continue to be high. And so at the end of this evaluation, I am positive that we will say Navajo diabetes rates are continuing to increase. They will continue to be high. More money, more expertise is needed to bring these rates down. But again, we're going to be going around and around in circles, just like in one of the readings that we looked at. Dr. Diley talked about a lawsuit that was brought forth in San Juan County. And what happened is it just made this complete circle. They started right where they had begun. And so how many of those circles do we go through to achieve, a higher rate of education, a better status, as far as their health is concerned, and all, other areas as well. So, with interest, I, have read some of the articles that were provided, and I've always read other articles that she's published about, for instance, my colleagues in healthcare. Do you have anything on learning styles? Do you have anything on testing? And so I always go to Donna's treasure chest and pull out these things that she's done and share those with my colleagues. Different ways of testing. We know that, for instance, some of the work that I do with nursing education, students don't test very well, and when they come to the university, and they have not had a good exposure to reading for enjoyment and that sort of thing, and so therefore their writing skills suffer when they come into a program. And science. I mean, in the traditional Navajo way, and this is where Donna again talks about different ways of identify oneself. Being Navajo isn't just, there's not just this narrow road that you walk and say this is the Navajo way. There are different ways. Cultures change, cultures get modified, and so I think as educators, as people in society, we need to be aware of that. Who are the people that we're working with, that we're, trying to educate. Again, in education, I think Dr. White touched on this a little bit. There's a Navajo education system that's already out there. Children are exposed to education from day one in their homes. You don't have to sit within a classroom setting to receive education. There's a lot of education that goes on through there, and if we can somehow figure out how to build on that, I think we would solve maybe some of the issues that we continue to see in education. The whole issue of diversity, how do we really come around and acknowledge the diversity that's within all of society? I travel a lot, so I go to a lot of different places throughout our country. And when I say I'm from Utah, question marks immediately come up. I mean, you can almost see them up here. And of course, the Mormons come up. I hear questions about the use of the name Utes when I say I'm from the University of Utah. And, what does it mean? I mean, I had a big issue with that last year when we were talking about it here. I wrote a lot of letters, and they were read, but I don't think anything happened with that. What does it mean? Do we, students and faculty, staff, know what it means when we yell, "Go Utes"? I don't yell that anymore. I just, I say, I don't see any Utes out there. and I have worked with the Northern Ute. I've lived real close to the Ute Mountain Utes, the Southern Utes. I dance in the bear dance, so I know who the Utes are. And but and I was told, well, we honored the Utes by naming some streets up there, and I actually worked on Chipeta Way, and I asked around, do any of you know Chipeta? Who was Chipeta? Nobody. So, I think we have to really honor American Indian, Alaska Native people. We really need to learn from them and not just take it for granted that we can do these things and that's okay. That's how we acknowledge diversity. It's not so. Access to education, the right to enter an educational system. Where do we start? Calvin gave us some information on that. There's a lot of discussion going on right now among Indian educators. There's a National Indian Education Association that meets on an annual basis. A lot going on. And one article, like I said, we read talked about some of the legal issues that San Juan County has gone through. And so I look forward to Dr. Darley's work on education post No Child Left Behind. What has that done now to Indian education? Where are we? Where are we going given that history? And how are these issues, that we've identified in the road to education, where are they after this No Child Left Behind? So very, very interesting future, I think, the whole issue of fairness and how do we work with Indian education, even at the college level. How do we accommodate Native students? How do we get to their place where they thrive, to their worldview? How do we deal with them in this survivance, that a concept that was introduced to us tonight? And then how about the traditions? Because it's very true. I have also I serve as advisor to many educational programs. For instance, working in Montana with Montana State, I go up there and serve on some NIH-funded grants, and then I'm always asked, could you come and talk with our Indian students? So I do that, and you know, it's a very different world from where they've come from. Very racist societies that they've lived in, and now they're at the university level. And how do they begin to identify themselves as, you know, individuals as a college student? It's very hard. A lot of them come and they really have a difficult time, and family is always, you know, on their mind. It's very true. And so something happens within the family, and they're off, you know, back to the res. And so, you know, how can we meet them at that level and support them? And so I found Montana State has some very good programs where there are people assigned to work with students, you know, who can be available 24/7 and, you know, provide support as needed. And so that's something that we were writing a nursing education grant, and so that's what, you know, I was suggesting. And it's a very different concept, you know, to the nursing, College of Nursing and other places as well. So I think we need to, you know, identify, not just assume everybody comes, you know, at the same level. And having a child who works or who's going to school out on the East Coast, I, you know, have experienced that same kind of thing. A school where all the kids who come there have all been valedictorians or in the top 5% of their high school class, and they're all here at the same class. And just a lot of competition, and of course professors don't really care, you know, that, you know, they don't individualize homework and that sort of thing. But, you know, I've always told my daughter, make sure the first day of class you go up to the professor, talk to him or her, identify yourself, and, you know, at some point, you know, they have a lot of students in class, and they might look at the list of names and say, oh, yes, she came to see me. Okay, you know, I know who she is. She's an attentive listener. She's sitting up front, whatever. So just by that, you know, you might be able to, you know, work and connect with that professor. But, you know, a lot of times with Indian students, they're the first college student in their family. They don't get any of this advice from their parents. So, you know, if there's a friendly face at the school, and the students always cling to that, and, you know, who can give them advice. So just, you know, some ways that, you know, we can try to assist some students. And a lot of times, you know, I also hear stories of people who have achieved and have done very well. And they always come back and say, you know, when I was a high school student or wanted to go to college, I was told I was not college material. Just forget it, go home. And in a sense, that's what, you know, some of these stories were saying. I think that Donna read, you know, just don't bother, you're not college material. But they have, you know, persevered, and I think it's that Navajo way, Dinek-Etche way of thinking that has come out and said, you can do it. You know, you are in this survival mode, or you have gone through this before. You know, you can do it, and those are the people, you know, who've really, you know, been strong and gone through this educational process, you know, which can be very difficult. Most of my education, I've been, you know, the only Native student, and nobody, you know, tried to understand who I was, and but you know, for instance, in this college education, I understand there are, you know, a cohort of Native students, so that's good, and that's what Native students like to do, is find a colleague, find, you know, people who sort of understand, and, you know, they make up a nice cohort that will support one another. So, and again, I do commend Dr. Diley for the wonderful work she's done, and I know she will do more, and I thank you all for coming and having also share her work. Thank you.
name is in your mind. Resilient, for me, resilience, and what racism is all about. And so, in reading, and I again have been in Salt Lake for soon to be beginning my 12th year, and never did I think I would be here. When I heard when you say when you're from Utah, well, I had that when I came here. What do you mean take a job in Utah? But anyways, coming from a tribe, and it's amazing, having been born and had the pleasure of being, and as I guess the Creator chose where we need to be, and for whatever reason, He chose me to be born in the tribe is now known as Lumbees. When I was born, I was not a Lumbee. We were known as Croatan Indians of North Carolina. And if you read the history, we have a long, long, long journey. If you read more specifically of the Croatan Indians, you will find that we were part of the John White's Lost Colony, part of the settling of North Carolina. And so with that, why do I mention that? To just share with you a journey of long history of contact and long history of what it means to be out of the system. I also was born in a time of segregation, very strict segregation. Triracial, had, even though Indians of Robeson County, known as the Lumbees now, were the largest group, we didn't have a voice. We did have a college, though, the oldest college in the nation, a state college, and it was for only for our Indians. I was blessed to be born in a house of privilege, even though I was poor as anyone has ever lived, but a privilege that my grandmother, I was raised by my grandmother and my grandfather. My grandmother was a school teacher. My aunts were school teachers. And so it was a time of, of segregation when you're raised segregated. And I could take out the word Navajo and a lot of your research and put Indian, just Indian across the country. And I didn't know that, what really that meant, that I couldn't eat in a restaurant in town, I couldn't shop until I got out here in the big world. And, but the one thing that I think that I heard and reinforced again today is I knew who I was. Even though I couldn't eat in town, that didn't matter. But by being, again, privileged to be raised by a grandmother who had high standards, I think my family is a living example of the standards my grandmother set. And she raised every second of our life. We heard a tape played over and over. Every second of our life, she played, "You're not better than, you're not less than, but you're as good as." And so from that, to me, that was a tape that's played over and over for me who I am today. And so my journey started that. I didn't even know I was poor until I started to college and found a sociology class. And all of a sudden I thought, whoa, I must have been poor. I was financially poor, as most of our Indian people are. I've rarely found wealthy Indians. And we have some commonalities. And though we were raised as millionaires, and it sustained me, is that particular part of knowing who I was. I could tell you my genealogy at a very young age. And so, in that, not knowing at the time what segregation, what tools that gave, if you may, building blocks, and it was the values. During the time of where I was raised as an Indian person, and by the way, how many in the room have on your birth certificate under race stamped Indian? By the one, none of you looking around, there's no one. But mine it is. And I pride that. I take what from segregation, and I take that, and I show it when I do trainings. Because that to me is, my race was Indian, that was carved. And so I took, not knowing, it wasn't a good time to be an Indian. Remember, we're East Coast. And not, even though that, my grandmother never ever mentioned any of that. So I never was raised with a lot of negative input. You know, our land was taken, all of this. I never heard that. And not knowing that what I would have to be, how resilient that was helping me be. I went to New York, as you heard, and started to college with 4 children as a single mom. And there I started finding for the first time what this big world out here. I hate to say this as an educated person, but you know, I didn't know there was anybody but us. I didn't know there's other Indians until I left North Carolina as a teenager. And I never will forget, another Indian came on campus one time, and it was like, whoa, you know, everyone went to look at this other Indian. And so to share a long journey, and it's been a long journey, one of which I've been blessed from the Creator. I am on a journey from the Creator. And so my work started as a teacher in a pretty upscale middle-class community, only minority in the community, in the entire town, village. And at the point we bought the house there, it had a good educational system. I was married at the time, convinced my husband, which is Anglo, Schroeder, we needed a house in a community that had good education. So that came from from my grandmother. And we'd gone to all in. I went to school. We had a, good school system on every corner. In North Carolina, in my county, there was a town with not even a town, a community with Indian education. So some of the things that other Indians have been subjected to, we were not, because all of our teachers were Indian. All of our teachers were Indian. Our college was graduating our own people. The chancellor at the college was Indian. And so I say I was born into privilege. And we're not talking about poverty. We're not talking about socioeconomic. We're talking about privilege, what I was given that was going to sustain me in this work out here that I do. And found that, here I was the only minority on staff. Only my kids were the only minorities in the school system, I think. And left there to the bigger world, and that was education, New York State education. And then it hit me. What is discrimination all about? And what is racism all about? And what is prejudice all about? And again, I've been blessed with a voice from the Creator. I started challenging that system and saying, wait a minute here, things are not right. And that my work led me later to bilingual education. I had left education. The Indian community in Buffalo, I was working with the board of their Indian community, asked me to take the job of bilingual education. And that Buffalo schools had gotten 2 grants. And they'd been sitting there with nobody doing anything. And interesting, your reference to another situation down in San Juan. And I just said, I don't even know what bilingual education is. And I was going to apologize, but I usually have a philosophy, I don't apologize for something I can't control. And as you notice, both of my colleagues gave you references to their languages. Well, our language has been dead over 100 and some years, long before I was born. And so, and when they recruited me, the Indian community said, well, come, we need a strong administrator. I said, well, I don't have a clue what bilingual education is. They said, don't worry about it. The clan mothers and the elders said, don't worry about it. We'll help you. We just need a good administrator. And it was interesting when Dr. White was making reference to some of the languages. we went out, hired the staff and went out, and met with the tribal leaders, both Seneca and the Mohawk. And the one thing, talk about language and how we don't respect sometimes our languages. We had to sign off, and as administrator I agreed, that we would not teach tribal ceremonial languages in our curriculum. It was back in the early 80s, 81 to be specific, and no Seneca language wasn't written. And as we were teaching, it was being written for the first time. But I pledged, and this is where the fine line, the connections come in. A lot of our languages, most people are not aware, was just written in the last 20, 25 years. A lot of languages, and a lot have died. And depending upon the linguistic right in the language, depending on where the root words will come from. And so we made pledges, and we implemented and honored those pledges. We did not teach any languages, any words that were from ceremonies or any of the traditional words. And so took pride in that. One of my greatest feats, I think, is in my journey, is one of our Seneca teachers was an 83-year-old elder. If any of you know, keep track of the weather in Buffalo, New York, it's pretty inclement. She would take a bus, public transportation, 2 buses to get to school every day to teach the language. She was never late and rarely missed. One of the highest accomplishments of my career. She did not have a high school education, and not one of my staff was college graduate. I had 8 staff. And we talk about what the education system is for Indians. We can conclude, I'm going to conclude this statement, but not my comment. The education system in the United States has failed Indians. That's a given. And so I was smart enough to find a loophole in their union contract, their union negotiation, that said if a teacher's not certified, doesn't have credentials, it was set up for shop, but I found that loophole in their contract that they can be deemed teachers. And so fighting both sides of the union, I won. And my 83-year-old elder was given the status of a teacher, paid on the teacher's salary. That, to me, is one of my greatest accomplishments. There's not a plaque on my wall, but for me, in my heart of hearts, that she was a scholar. She had the PhDs. She had, what we have, and you've heard my colleagues here refer to I call it the informal education that sustains us as individuals. It's not the formal education, and why Indians are resilient is that informal education coming from our tribal roots, our tribal values, that sustains us and helps us be resilient to what is or is not in the system for us. And I just think back, and then all of my teachers were granted that status. And so I just, what can we do when we were in that, to me, then I thought, whoa, and not knowing where my journey was going and not knowing what I was ahead of me, the fight, that job propelled me. I was appointed American Indian language delegate for New York State. And that propelled me to the national scene. In my first conference, I attended the National Bilingual Conference, about 3,000 or 4,000 people. There was one workshop on Indian languages. And I attended it. 2 European Americans were sitting during the workshop, and literally a gentleman, an Indian, was sitting in the corner. Every time a question was asked, the Indian had to answer it. But he was not on the program, and so I stopped the incoming president, and I said, I just came out of a workshop that I trust as you as president of this organization will never allow to happen again. we became friends later on, and he said to his entourage, when I walked away, who let her off the reservation? So it was, and so, and anyone in the room that knows me knows that that's a small token of, yes, I'm not afraid to speak out. But that, though, started questioning Washington, D.C. of what we were doing with languages for Indians. And thank heavens, Dr. Jesse Soriano, who was here, he's here in Utah. Most people don't know this, but he was Assistant Secretary of Education in Washington, D.C. He was director of OBIMLA, which is bilingual and world languages, foreign language. I started calling him. So he assembled about 18, 20 Indians. From that, we came out with he flew out and met with us. And again, another high honor that I was given. 3 days, he just said, okay, here's our summary of what we want. And one was a National Indian Bilingual Center. And he said, okay, select 4 people to go to Washington and write the federal regs. No, I was in the group without a language base. And the elders that were in the room, I was one of the 4 selected to go to Washington. That was a humble experience, of one of which I have taken serious the rest of my life. I did go to Washington. We had a National Indian Bilingual Task Force. We had national centers all over the United States. And one was faltering, and I just said, interview me. My children were on their own at that point. And I left, gave notice, 3 days notice, and walked out of a job and got on a plane and went to Oklahoma. And we were not successful, but at least we were bringing attention. We had our national conference in Washington, D.C., and there seemed like a lot of Indians to other people. There were only about 5 or 6 of us. And we were going to hold a press conference. And all the people at the conference, 3,000 or 4,000 strong, said, you Indians will not get anyone at your press conference. Not only did we get local press, we had 14 different press there. And we stayed up pretty much all night getting our press release together. But we brought attention to the plight of our languages for the first time at a national level. Some of my colleagues have gone on that we started that. Unfortunately, as most things for Indians, it was not refunded another cycle. But I stayed in that tribe because given the honor from the elders to represent them in the language. Took my journey to Alaska. I became the first Indian serving on the National Bilingual Association and went on to be president, the first Indian. And when I was selected, I also had gone back to school in Alaska and got my administrative degree, master's. And as you've heard, I heard over and over, I was a trainer working for National Center in Alaska. I heard over and over from European Americans, Caucasians that came up for the big money, these natives can't learn. And that to me, and yet I would go into villages and the entire villages would turn out to hear what I had to say. As the first Indian going into, it was usually Caucasians going in. And so I thought, well, they can learn. That's who I am. So I'd gone back to school to get my administrative degree to go out to be a principal. I got a job. As I was mailing the contract at the airport, I went to a national meeting and was elected president. I share this only because I had a decision to make, to be a principal in a village that I thought could make a change, or be on the national level. And I pledged to the Creator that He saw fit, He was directing my journey, that I wouldn't work for a year. I would, as the grain of sand is to the ocean, that I would give my year and respect and honoring the ancestors who paid heavy with their lives for language and their culture. And that's why we're here today, is what is all the research about? And I didn't. Put my stuff in storage, called a tribal member in Washington, D.C., she's an attorney, and I think it was interesting how my journey has come to be. At that precise moment I called her, she said I was just writing an ad for a roommate. I went to Washington and stayed that year. I traverse this country, speaking wherever I can. It isn't, though, about me, because I was being guided by a higher power, the Creator, to bring awareness and a reason why I'm in Utah. And again, taking even the school district that I work for, bringing this back into why does Indians have to struggle so much in the educational system? If you take, and I went to down to Gathering of the Nations and made a whole 90-minute tape just on children doing a powwow and how happy they were. How happy they were. But you take those same children and follow them through the Western education system. Why? How many smiles do you see on their faces when they become in junior middle school and then in high school? Why? Why is our education system that, thank you for the research you've done, why has it failed us? Why do we still have to struggle? Why are our kids have the highest dropout rate in the nation? Why do we have the lowest graduation rate in the nation, aside from all the other high things that are negative? When is it going to turn around for us? And I applaud the Navajo Nation. Navajo Nation, among all of our tribes, true, they're big. True, they have a lot of resources that smaller tribes don't. But they're setting precedent that has never been set in this country. Their research and bringing on their own. These are growing your own. And that's what this is about. What does this research have to do with all of us? What does it have to do with all of us, and what difference does it make? It makes a difference because, as one of our elders have said, what happens to one happens to all, because we are interconnected. And so, again, commending both the Navajo Nation and Dr. Dowley for her research. But again, the Navajo Nation is taking it again, taking control of their own destiny and the Navajo people's destiny by doing their own research, compiling their own research through native eyes. And for some of you worked in the room, worked with me on the Cygnus conference this past year, and it was just such an honor to be there, and colleagues from Alaska, colleagues from around the country, talking about the native way of knowing. You know, that song, and I play it at all my training, Cherokee Nation. And if you know the words for that, are we on the brink of they are learning from us finally? And yes, we have been freeze-framed for too long. And, you know, I go out to school and the little kids will say, "You're not an Indian." And I said, "What makes an Indian?" "Well, you don't have buckskin, and you don't have boots on, and you don't have. The University of Florida, Gainesville, did some research, and I worked with some of their grad students. And I challenge everyone in the room, go into a school or go into any setting and have children draw 3 images of Indians. And we talked about, Dr. White mentioned contemporary Indians, because we don't run around with buckskin. All of us never did run around with buckskin, you know. And why? Why do we have this Hollywood image that we have to live up to? When is it going to be accepted? When are we? The researchers show, I guarantee you, I have yet to do it, and I do a lot of trainings, that the 3 top things of drawing of an in is what? What would you say they are?
Male with a headdress.
That's one.
Yeah.
A teepee, Tommy Hawk, and someone's standing there, a stick figure with a breechcloth. Why is that? We're living in 2009. Folks wrote the Constitution over 200 years ago. Why is that image still propelled in all of the work in our school? Why? Some of the colleagues in the room, we sat on the state under Dr. Foster, state Indian task force, and we developed curriculum. I'd like to think in my lifetime I could see it implemented in schools. It's been 5-6 years, and I guarantee you it won't be in my life in Utah, for sure. A lot of work has gone through Indian Eyes developing that curriculum. Why is it so hard to talk about resilient? Well, and we talk about racism and prejudice. What part of this is racism? What part of this don't they get? That this is blatant discrimination. We have an ownership, if you're Indian in the sound of my voice, we have an ownership to correct them because of our ancestors, in the name of our ancestors, to correct what is wrong, and to pledge every day that we will correct something that is wrong, that history has dealt us a bad hand, education has dealt us a bad hand. In this freeze framing, as I don't do workshops now in Indian, my topic is I ain't the Indian you were expecting. Because I'm so tired of people saying, well, wait a minute, I'm not here to make you feel good. That isn't why I'm here. But, and again, talking about racism and discrimination, is I, as a Lumbee Indian, have been subjected to racism and discrimination from more Indians than I have ever raised segregated. My tribe is recognized, and as I shared with you in the beginning, it's stamped on my birth certificate Indian. I feel I was born Indian, I'll die an Indian. Why is it so difficult where we as Indian people have an ownership? Why do we discriminate? Why do we commit blatant acts of racism against other Indians? Why? We have bought into a system of racism and discrimination. We have bought into the system that has brainwashed us to go against our own people. It's called divide and conquer. And so I think in honor of today and bringing it back, maybe it's not what you wanted to hear, but the talk, all throughout your papers, and I read them, yeah, we've heard it all. But I think the question now is taking this research and taking us today, what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with it? If we walk out of the room today, what are we going to do with this? And we've got a leader leading us on the path. And so, in concluding, I again thank you, humbled for being here, honored, and thank you for letting me be part of your bookends. And thank you.
We have time for 2 questions. If somebody's interested in asking Dr. Diley a question, please bring them along or just have a question. No question?
I was a high school teacher in Chippewa and taught classes that were entirely Navajo students. Not being somewhat naive at the time, I didn't think about it a whole lot, but it felt like there was some amount of I guess what I would call cultural imperialism. The students had a good relationship with each other, but the knowledge itself they didn't have a good relationship with. Did you find that in your experience?
I'm not quite sure of your question. I'm sorry.
Okay. The core content that we were required to teach was very much based on some cultural assumptions that were never questioned. And so even in a reservation school with Navajo students, there was a hostile environment created. Did you find that in the students you talked to?
Yes, I think in a lot of contexts, especially when how you were represented in the textbooks is so horrible in the curriculum. And that's where I think the Navajo Nation and taking over and asserting their rights for the formalized school system, that they can stop those kinds of things. I mean, when I started here in Utah, the 7th grade history book talked about the Paiutes as grasshopper eaters. I mean, it was a very degrading kind of representation. And so as people take over, as Native people take over the education that, or the formalized schooling that their kids are subjected to, those kinds of hostile situations may be lessened.
I would comment on that. I was a teacher for 15 years in the reservation, and as an indigenous person teaching this white mainstream curriculum, a lot of times you had to take the responsibility in selecting and inserting what you're talking about and trying to provide students with more positive information in history. Because you can, what you're referring to, cultural imperialism, I definitely felt as a teacher and as a student. I went to school K through 12 on reservation, and so, you know, as an indigenous person, knowing your history helps in trying to provide a better perspective on what the curriculum provides. Because, I mean, we're told as teachers when we go there that we can't, that we have a set curriculum, and that you must teach these specific goals and, you know, through the curriculum. But I think that personally I made different choices in accordance to being sensitive to students, because I had 98, 99% students in my class at American.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. That's very good.
I had a question about the information that Kelvin was talking about the two knowledge systems, and about how the Navajo people view there's a male system, which is what he's calling Naye, and then there's a female system, which is Wajnoje, and the two pretty much I've run through Union College that are not very separable. They complement each other and work with one another. Therefore, when he made reference to changing a woman, it doesn't cross into the male system of knowledge and learning. But the two coexist and complement one another. And we as individuals take heed to both sides and learn both sides. And we're told as a human being, you embody both male and female. And I appreciate you sharing that.
No.
Do you have any final comments?
Just thank you very much. I'm very humbled. Thank you.
See you again.
Before I know we have some of the panelists that need to leave, so we appreciate them. And can we give them one more round of applause? Before I bring Dean Hartman up to make some final remarks for Donna, I'd like to make one announcement, and that's about our keynote speaker this week for the Martin Luther King Week celebration. Rigoberto Menchú, who's a Nobel Peace Prize winner for 1992, will be here at Kingsbury Hall Thursday, January 15th at noon. So be sure to try to make that lecture. Dean Hartman, we have very, very talented faculty in this college. Our distinguished senior scholar has to have a terminal degree more than 10 years out. So that gives us a pretty big pool of people to look at. And we've asked for recommendations. We've gotten quite a few letters of recommendations, and Donna clearly this year rose to the top. We The dean and I made the final decision after we got those recommendations, and it was pretty easy for us to say that Donna was the one that we felt was most deserving. So if there were prayers, those prayers didn't have to be yelled very loudly, because we clearly understood the body of her work, the 25 years of that research, to do the kind of work she does, to make the connections to a community, to earn their trust, to go through and be a fighter for them, to work hard and diligently on lawsuits in their honor to protect their rights. We know that we've chosen the right person as our Diversity Distinguished Senior Scholar for 2008-2009. So, in recognition of Donna's work, I'd like you to stand, and Dean Hartman has a present for you, and we hope that you will show off and have the pleasure of remembering this moment that not only the College of Education, the University of Utah, the Navajo Nation, the Indian Nation, First Peoples Nation, and all people who stand for social justice, equity, access, and diversity recognize you on this day.
Remarks and first say this is truly a week of reflection and celebration of life and the contributions of a great man and all that he's meant to this nation and this world. And tonight we celebrate our first distinguished scholar in diversity, access, and equity, Professor Donna Diley. And in truly doing so, I just want to say in doing so, we are the ones who are honored. We're honored by your contributions, what you mean to this college, and all that you have done on behalf of your colleagues and students throughout the years. Thank you. We're going to have our open.